as an empirically existential reality. Ellul says the spoken word ushers us into another dimension, that is the relationship with other living human beings with persons. The word is the particularly human sound which differentiates us from everything else. So the visual is an image, not a vision of reality. And we hear in those words of Ellul echoes of Augustine's confession. What is human language and what are words? Asks Augustine. They are even a textual word, a sign of something vital, a spoken word. Augustine's understanding of hermeneutics is predicated on the primacy of speech. As my colleague Yun understands it, in the Confessions, Augustine conducts his philosophical inquiries on time in terms of utterance. He insists on the philosophical priority of sound to the formation of melody and text, reinforcing the temporal precedence of speaking to writing. The Doctrina Christiana offers Augustine's most concentrated treatment of science. But the principles permeate through his other texts as well, the Confessions, the City of God, to the Magistra, and the narrations on the Psalms. Truth and language are correlated in the spoken word, and true knowledge abides in face-to-face, personal relations. In both, the ultimate linguistic reality is oral. But now, what does Augustine make inescapable? And Ellul uses it in his contradiction of technique. The definitive word for both Ellul and Augustine is the word incarnate. The opening words of the Gospel of John are commonly quoted. In the beginning was the Word. And they're not afraid of verse 14 either. That is, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. In the most radical sense, the incarnation announces the essence of speech as the original, personal, and meaningful language. Both Augustine and Ellul understand existence in terms of the uncreated, eternal word. They argue the spoken word needs speech to originate it, to predicate all else spoken in existence requires a ground of spoken being. While the spoken word is definitive for Ellul, as it is for Augustine, the issue they consider non-negotiable is the problem of truth and rhetoric. And that's one way of describing their distinctiveness. They are not just epistemic. That is, how do we know what we know? Ellul says truth is neither objective content nor intersubjective coherence. And he thereby places himself in the middle of what appears to be an intractable dilemma, repudiating both correspondence and coherence views of truth. He appears to make a predicament for the nature of truth altogether. And Augustine finds himself in the same conundrum, having rejected both the correspondence view of truth in classical Greece and the coherence views that are now beginning to take shape in its era as an alternative. Together they say that truth depends on the person, specifically the Word of God, the incarnate Christ. Ellul proclaims with Augustine that the Word must be believed to be a predicate to meaningful rhetorical action. So together, Ellul and Augustine stand as proponents and practitioners of an aletheia, the Greek term truth, an aletheia philosophy of rhetoric. That is, the rhetoric of truth revealed in person. Augustine focuses decisively on rhetoric as an aletheic act. And in the process, he contradicts the highly secular and linear view of the ancient Greeks. Aletheic rhetoric concerns ultimate questions of belief that demand a yes or no, and metanoia, a change of mind in which a new vision of life replaces an older one. The inspiration associated with aletheia proceeds in this supra-rational mode, not according to ordinary human understanding. In aletheic rhetoric, the problem of truth becomes an issue of axiology. It involves a unity of form and content that is true to a standard. For example, moral rectitude or ethical fidelity. Telling the truth depends on the quality of discernment so that penultimates do not gain the ultimacy. Truth means, in other words, to strike gold, to get at the heart of the matter, the essence, the nub, the authentic disclosure of what's underneath. Truthfulness is a basic principle because of its capacity to integrate with other norms. The Augustinian legacy subverts contemporary discourse that defines truth as mere facticity. Truth as aletheia generates a constructive ambiance that links truth with moral principles and resists pragmatic relativism. So for Ellul and Augustine, truth is not propositional but relational. A dialogically interpersonal, sacramentally charitable act rather than a statement. The aletheic rhetoric of Augustine is theorized in triadic and personal terms, that is, it's eternally present in the triune God and populated in time by human beings in dynamic rhetorical relationship, guided by the virtues of faith, hope, and love. Augustine interpreted charity as a rhetorical act, directed radically to people, not texts. The humiliation of the word correlates resistance to la technique via loving one's neighbor. So correspondence to reality is not the definition of truth. It's a definition of facticity, a measure of accuracy. An accuracy of language refers to a form and content important in science, and intersubjective coherence remains relevant in the arts. But truth is found in faithfulness within language and persons to whom we speak. The call to love God and neighbor is realized in and through language, in action, as mediated by a super-rational revelation. Ellul is speaking his prophetic witness to the Christian community as he is to a technicized culture. The challenge is, in the Christian community, is language understood in biblical terms, so that oral, interpersonal language that begins with a faith commitment is the standard by which we judge other mediated forms. Or do we, in our proclamation, our missions, our everyday conversation, in effect extend, believe in, a technicized version of, represent such a way of speaking, and then periodically add on this deeper meaning, but allow fundamentally la technique, or truth as accuracy, and facts as proposition, to dominate the way we understand communication. Again, there is no humiliation of the word, no propaganda, no reference throughout his work and presence of the kingdom, no technological bluff, and no technological system. All books dealing with communication and information, except that Ellul is dependent on, lived out of the vision that Augustine gave him. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Cliff. That's a great start to this session. And I'd like to take the first question for Cliff. Go ahead.
I was wondering, last night you said something about saying that the humiliation of the word was a somewhat wrong-headed book. I have some critiques of that book myself, but I wanted to hear why you made that comment.
I'm turning, right. What I meant by that, and I've written about it, I only need to make a comment now. What Ellul does in that book is not concentrates fundamentally on the spoken word as he should. It's there, and that's what I'm representing here. Therefore, he's correlating with the Augustinian tradition. But in terms of his judgment about visual symbols, the humiliation of the word, the title itself says to me that Ellul is focusing on beginning with print, with the logic of print, with the rationality of print. When, in Augustine's terms, and clearly if you see Ellul depending on Augustine for his theory of communication, it's oral communication that judges all mediated forms. I love Neil Postman. The colleagues who studied with him are some of the best in the field, and they're here in this audience. But one ends up with some of the same dynamics there, right? That the shift from print to visual creates a predicament for our society because democracy and education is dependent on print, and we're losing it. And that's a secondary statement. The question is, how can we recover an oral communication that believes you need a faith commitment that makes persons and not the mediated forms central to our passion, to our way of thinking about the world, to evaluating the new technologies. We now have digital, and we can interact with each other, and therefore democracy will prosper. And this is better than electronic forms in which a newscaster to 1 million are talking. It's interactive and dialogic. The point of comparison there is with broadcasts, when the question should be, and which I believe Augustine makes inescapable, that is, how does this form, this mediated form, meet the standards of spoken word in which charity, human relations are enhanced and centered as a result. Thanks for asking that. I'd love to say some more about it.
There's a question, there's a hand right here.
This is young Wheaton. I had mentioned him. That is, in the work on Augustine, seeing the spoken word as a way of understanding the concept of temporality, the notion of time. Yes, go ahead.
My question is kind of some civilization is, I think, in my humble opinion, is just a product of human intellect. So my question is, how much did they share in defining the notion of concept of the intellect? Was it great? Because I think there is a very important content because if I follow your logic, so your argument could be reduced into the one kind of some problem or an issue of how many units. It means it again can be reduced again into the how can we get the certainty of our interpretation over script or divinity or divine word.
Yeah.
And then not to mention about some social employment of technology in that case. So,
Well, I'm looking forward to the papers on the prophetic in Ellul, because his argument would be, isn't it, that we speak a prophetic word. Clearly, there must be metanoia, or transformation, in our own thinking, and we testify to it. We're interested in political, economic, structural change. But his principle of nonviolence seems to say that we provide a witness. Prophecy means that you speak the truth. And therefore, it's our responsibility, even though humiliation of the word makes it prominent, the way that technicized communication now is uprooted from the human. And it's cast in the hands of authorities and powers who want to control and manipulate rather than enhance human life. Then the obligation fundamentally for the prophetic mind is to witness to the truth. How it should be. And you keep holding up this testimony and making it visual in the way, or visible in the way that you treat other human beings. Ivan Illich, in his Tools for Conviviality, argues the same thing. That is, industrialization moving toward hyper-industrialization. And how do you stop it? When the dynamics and Ellul is part of that, right? All seem to push toward deeper, wider, more monopolized forms of communication that squelch, dominate the human, and put us under judgment based on the visual. But his argument is you raise up communities in which tools are convivial, you speak the prophetic word, you testify to the way it should be done, and that's our calling. It's a good question, obviously, and needs some more elaboration. Do we have time
I
yet?
see two hands, and we may have time for two questions.
I'll try to make them short.
Go ahead, here, Tennessee.
I also thought the humiliation word was a very wrong-headed book because he's hoisted himself upon a contradiction that runs throughout philosophy of language from the first philosophers of language up to today. Namely that if you think of language as a system that is somewhere outside of yourself, then you would look for the meaning in the sign out there. But as soon as you've done that, then you have abstracted, externalized language, and you are living in the world of Ellul's technology. And Ellul presents us with exactly that understanding of communication, and then turns around and says that, of course, it can't be that way because you have to say it from your heart, or the communication has, but you can't have it both ways. And Ellul always tries to have it both ways, because he's not a semiotician or a semiologian. And this is, I think, a very important aspect of Ellul's that he didn't think through very clearly, and that is a good example.
Oh, well said. I mean, those of us who study Ellul appeal to his dialectic, right? To his saying, Kierkegaard is in my heart. And I don't quote him as much. The other books are on the shelf, but Kierkegaard belongs to me. And therefore, he can say a totalizing no and a redeeming yes. Simultaneous. And how to do that well is clearly what we mean by the prophetic. That is, how does one implement that today? And clearly the prophet is not just the word spoken, but exhibitor of one's life too. There, I'm just thinking of Aristotle as you were talking, and he says in Aesthetics that if we communicate only pity and fear, inferior, it has to have catharsis. One must enable the audience to get a hold of this and move forward. And that's the kind of language Ellul is calling us for. And I believe, even though you're saying he's often, can be considered to be this intractable dilemma, there are those possibilities of speaking in a way, in the arts, in preaching, in teaching, in journalism, that as a matter of fact, it's not just fear, tears, but catharsis, healing. Saw a diary of Anne Frank 2 nights ago. That beats Aristotle's test. And I believe that's the kind of communication in the arts that Ellul will be looking for. Not just a diatribe about diatribe the wrong word. It's hell from beginning to end about word. Here's a storefront owner with a family trying to live in a way that only is possible. Who would love that question? I'll be shorter on this.
You can state your question for everyone's benefit, and we can get a short answer from Cliff, and then you two can follow up later.
Well, I'm nervous to ask this question because I'm going to be speaking on it a bit later, but I'm going to do it anyway. Maybe we can follow up then. But with a focus on oral language in contrast to sort of the technologized forms of language and media, what about symbolic interactionism that takes other cultural forms that are not spoken, but that are social, spatial, symbolic interaction in cultural practice that might actually have some of those same qualities of oral communication? Do they fit within the same realm as that where Ellul would?
Yeah, that's really a tough question because you can't even begin to answer it unless you make human communication absolutely central. It's humanocentric to a way that, as your question implies, many of our colleagues find unacceptable. It's species arrogance, right, against other forms of communication. We'll have to discuss
follow
that.
that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to your presentation.